here at ANZVASC. My background is on immune diseases for a number of years in the context of my being a kidney specialist. So I guess in the forms of vasculitis, I'm particularly the ones that affect the kidney, but I have some awareness at least of other forms of vasculitis. I should say before my colleagues introduce themselves, your ears may have been burning because we did spend the last 10 minutes or so talking about how, as a society, as a professional society, we can best serve the people who have this condition. We are, obviously our key mission of the society is to better care, education, treatment and research for people with vasculitis. And so I do want to say we need to, and please keep reminding us.
Hi, my name is Catherine Hill. I'm a rheumatologist from Adelaide, and I'm currently Deputy Chair of the ANZVASC Society, which Richard set up. So I'm here to help answer some questions, and I'm really pleased you've come along.
Hi, my name is General Pei, Mr. Pei. I'm a renal physician based in Adelaide.
I think this microphone works better. My name's Mark Street. I think many of you know me. I'm not a doctor. I'm actually started med school, but I've got a master's in immunology and currently a pilot. But I'm here for you mainly just for as a consumer advocate. So if you've got any concerns, questions that you want to raise, certainly raise them with me, and then I can forward them on to the appropriate people. So I want to thank you all for coming as well. There's a massive turnout, which is really pleasing to see. So I hope you've got as many questions as you like, and we'll try to answer them as best we can.
And I'm Damien Heath, I'm an immunologist, so primarily I think it's through Mark. If you have any feedback about what you might want in the future as patients and carers or people involved on the harder side of vasculitis, the patient side, then we're very willing to take your feedback. We plan on always having patient involvement. It's not something that's been done widely in Australia, far more as Mark's aware in the States, largely because of numbers, to be honest. But we plan, I would think, to increase the amount of patient involvement and then perhaps also have state-by-state smaller meetings where patients can ask questions or carers can ask questions. So if you do have any feedback, please send it through to Mark, and then we will be assured we will take cognizance of that feedback and hopefully then better in future work. Emma said patients with vasculitis often find it challenging to manage the ongoing physical and mental aspects associated with the disease. There is a lack of holistic approach to the management of the disease. What support is available for patients with chronic diseases such as vasculitis, and how can we change the level of care to better holistically manage and support the range of symptoms a patient may experience? Easy question.
Yes, I know. I have the hard question, and I think that's. I think we don't do this as well as we could in the hospital setting where most patients with vasculitis are seen, and I think that's one of the reasons we wanted to set up this society, is that so we can better care for patients with vasculitis and do a more holistic approach. In fact, before you came in, we were talking about ways we could better support patients. And I think, for my part, part of that will be educating some of the allied health professionals better, so that if you need to go and see a psychologist, or that would be helpful, they actually know something about vasculitis, because that must be very hard when you've got a rare disease, and a lot of other health professionals don't know anything about it either, not to mention family members and friends, and sometimes even your local doctor probably won't know much either. So that's part of what we want for our society, and we hope that we know it's not as good as it could be now, but we want it to be better.
Yeah, I think the Australian healthcare system has a number of advantages, but it has the potential to be quite fragmented, and so we formed a vasculitis clinic, and that has been successful. But even for context, we have a hospital on site. We got 4 rooms on a Friday afternoon, once a fortnight, in a maternity clinic. And so that was good. We would have liked to have had a psychologist, we would have liked to have a social worker available, but that was seen as a success within my healthcare system. Most people here do actually think about people in a holistic way, because we see people with these conditions that have long-term implications, and the question is almost to us, what can we do about it? And from our perspective, I think publicising this condition to our colleagues, making sure people are aware of it, and encouraging people to work in a multidisciplinary way, and again, encouraging people to get in touch with and work with other health professionals and the care of people with vasculitis. As is a complex and difficult question, but I think it should be tackled, unfortunately, slowly. It shouldn't be tackled quickly, but it will be tackled slowly and across multiple different levels, which sounds like a bit of a cop-out, but I think part of this aim of the society is to get, for example, even at a small level, instead of someone with vasculitis going to see a rheumatologist and then somebody going to see a nephrologist, try and get these people talking to each other, if not them in the same room together at the same time. And that's a very I've just medicalised the question, I've realised, and I feel bad for doing it, but I guess that's part of the start of the answer.
So that's something that the clinicians among ourselves have to fix within our own area and working across other specialties. But coming back to Emma's question, putting myself in Emma's position, I would like to know what does it look like in the next few years? Let's say if this society gets up and running, what sort of support services can I tap into? Is it online only? Is it physical, face-to-face meetings? Mark, I'm trying to on the spot. What would you like to? What do you think it should look like from a patient?
Yeah, that's a difficult question to answer, but I think a good start would be some sort of online forum or even an online discussion where you can have various specialists come on board and people can come free with their questions. I think that would be a good start.
Right, thank you. I guess one problem is that rare disease, Australia doesn't do rare disease well, and that starts at the top, that starts with government. And I don't differentiate between parties in government or even states in government or federal or local or state, is that we don't approach, there is no generic approach to rare disease, and that if you have a rare disease, you are biased against it. You are less likely to have a voice, because there's only, say, 5 of you compared to 1 million of you who have cardiovascular disease, and that we have a very good approach to those more common diseases. But only in the last 10 years has it been recognised, and even still not recognised, that these kind of diseases that you may be suffering from are rarer, and are rare enough for almost no one to pay attention. We want to pay attention to you, and we think other people should pay attention to you, but if you don't have a voice, if we don't have a voice, no one will hear us. And that's part of involving you today in this, is we want to develop a voice, because trust me, politicians don't really listen to doctors that much, because they have a lot of people saying, woe is me, please give me money. So if you look at it from the point of view of the politician, a lot of people are approaching them. I'm terrible, I've got nothing, I need some money. And that soon glosses over, they don't listen to that anymore. But if you have a national body, both involving doctors, alternative, other healthcare professionals and patients who are all saying something, that's much more powerful. And I think that's the way forward if we're looking at more collaborative approaches. Right, now, I have a second question, and I presume it's here. By the way, if anyone doesn't actually want to read out their own question, just point back at me and I'll read it for them, just in case you're shy or just don't want to do it. So, ask why are certain autoimmune diseases such as vasculitis excluded from a number of life insurance policies, and yet why do these same companies not provide life insurance to these people? It appears we are too sick to be covered, but not as sick enough to claim. Insurance policies. So if you're looking at life insurance, and then there's a thing called dread disease insurance, and then there's total and permanent disability, and then there's income protection. And it depends where you get your policy from. So there is this thing called the PDS, the Product Disclosure Statement. It will never have been read by anyone in this room because it's really long and boring, but it's really important. I have seen a man with GPA who paid into his owner-operated business, company or business, he owns something farming-wise, and he paid into his insurance policy for 25 years. And then he got GPA, which disabled him to the point where he could only work part-time in his own business, and he wasn't covered because he didn't read his policy where it said we only cover this list of diseases. And of course GPA or vasculitis is not on that list of diseases. And they are within their rights to say that and you must read your policy. And if you can't read it, you need them to explain it to you because it is actually a requirement for if you have insurance, for your insurance company to explain to you what it does and doesn't do. They might try not to do that, but it's actually in the rules, especially now under recent banking inquiries, and that plenty of people probably have cover that's useless. If you have cover in your super, almost invariably that cover will only cover you for the job you are doing now. And trust me, it's really hard to be disabled enough not to do any job at all. And so you need to look at your policy and see what it covers. Then when you look at total and permanent disability, that's what that means. It depends on your policy. If you have a policy that says, if I cannot do my job that I'm employed at now, therefore I'm covered, that's all you need to say. But and doctors don't, trust me, doctors don't have any say on this. We have a say if you're totally disabled, but if the insurance company disagrees, they'll get their own independent expert who they'll listen to. Then they write back a letter to you how you're wrong.
I think that probably one area where the answer to the second question is, do specialists communicate with insurance companies only when, my answer is only when a patient of mine wants me to, I will. But I think one area where perhaps we as a community need to be careful about is when a disease is defined or redefined, and the banking scandal was one where they redefined the definition of a heart attack. So I guess vasculitis is one area where, as you probably know, vasculitis is not one disease, it's a series of diseases, and our understanding of what is vasculitis and what types of vasculitis there is evolving. So one area that might be relevant if you were thinking about taking out a policy was to ensure that the disease is described adequately and that you're actually being covered for what really is your disease, or ask even for a definition. Because that was one of the problems, one of the key sentinel cases in the Royal Insurance Life Insurance Royal Commission was this redefinition of disease. And I think that's probably another thing to add to what Damon said that might be worth looking at. I guess one thing that might be changing about vasculitis, and we haven't seen the data yet, certainly ankylosing vasculitis, and I think Chena will tell me if I'm wrong, but the most recent data was, and the data from the 1950s was that people with ankylosing vasculitis, that didn't know what ankle was, would do very badly, but now we know people do relatively well. And we think that the most recent trial, the Pixie-based trial, actually had to recruit more patients because people are actually doing really well. So one thing I guess we could think about would be if new data comes out to show that the outcome of these diseases are improving, that we make sure insurance companies know about it. And just thinking about it off the top of my head, that might be something we could ensure happens, because there's still the most contemporaneous data. The best data is still from a bunch of trial populations in the early 2000s. That probably will be superseded in the next few years, at least for ANCA-associated vasculitis. Maybe not for other forms of vasculitis. So I guess thinking about it some more, could we communicate with insurance companies? We can probably make sure that insurance companies understand what the latest information is about the outcome of the conditions that they're thinking of excluding. Whether that will change their behaviour, I don't know.
Yeah, just thinking out loud, I wonder whether we could have something on our website which is sort of some information for insurance companies or something. Other thing I would say is when you're interacting with insurance companies over this, get an advocate. Now that might be your financial planner, or it might be someone else to help you advocate. And also my experience from personal experience of needing to get access to that sort of money was that you can negotiate with them. It does take a bit of time, and it's really useful to have an advocate. And
if you're an industry sympathiser, use your union. Negotiate, because they'll take that up on your behalf. Because these things are difficult to explore. Trust me, doctors reading PDS statements are only better than you. So we may not be any better advocate than you are. And it's not something, it's actually a burden. You hate having to fill these forms in. You never know what you have to write on them. Some people can be really, you say that when you look it down on paper, it sounds like they're fine. Because when you answer the questions, you go, oh, it sounds like you probably go back to work, but there's no way they can go back to work. So the questions are written as form letters. They're not written for someone with your illness. So they are complex. Now moving on to the next question. Is there a universal protocol for rituximab induction and maintenance? Or is each patient treated according to their disease state?
Oh, actually, I've handed this one over to now, actually.
Thanks, Katrin. Okay, Perry, thanks for that question. Well, the good news is that not everyone needs rituximab for induction. And the good news is also that not everyone needs rituximab for maintenance. But if your condition requires rituximab, and I'm going to, there's no universal protocol for rituximab, but generally it runs like this. It's 2 doses given 2 weeks apart. So it is 1,000 milligram given intravenously on day 1. You have a break of 2 weeks, and then another 1,000 milligram is given intravenously 14 days later, 2 weeks later. So that's an often used protocol. There is an older protocol which is older because it started sort of copied what cancer specialists used to give lymphoma patients. Rituximab was first available in Australia, not for vasculitis, but for lymphoma. And in that protocol, they give 375 milligram per meter square. So you have to work out the body surface area and multiply by 375 milligram. Now that's most of us who give it find it a little bit harder to work out, whereas 1,000 milligram twice over 2 weeks is much easier to give. So that's an often used protocol. And the good news is if your doctor thinks that the patient or you need rituximab, your doctor can apply for permission to the PBS. And in my experience, you get the permission within a few minutes online or within a few days by slow mail. So that's a very important step forwards for Australian patients, and that started from 2016. So that's widely available now.
Now, what I was asking the question is because a lot of them are on the dose every 2 weeks, where I'm still on 4 doses every 4 weeks.
Okay, so that's the...
So is that the old?
Yes, that's the older
It's not necessarily worse or better. There's no comparison between them.
Yes, I want to know.
Yeah.
There's no comparison at all. And one is not right and one is not wrong.
Kerry, the good news is that we think both works. And for the average patient, the dose difference is not that great by using either protocol. In terms of maintenance, it's much harder to answer because there is no established protocol for maintenance, and those of us who work in this field is still trying to work out for those patients who actually need to have more and more rituximab, for months or years. When do you give it? Do you give it every few months, or do you give it only when your anchor becomes positive? So that's still being worked out.
Yeah, I think adding to that complexity is that while if you have a certain type of condition and you have some significant contraindications, like also you can get rituximab for induction, in other words the 4 times 375. Rituximab is not, strictly speaking, not TGA approved for maintenance, and that's the Therapeutic Goods Association. Right? Administration, sorry. And you won't say that. So at the moment, it's not because it necessarily doesn't work, it's not because it's dangerous, but it's not approved for, nor is it funded by the PBS, the Pharmaceutical Benefit Scheme, for maintenance. So adding to the fact that Chinao is entirely right that we don't know for sure, or even half for sure, how to use rituximab in maintenance, we often have to trade off with our hospitals. So in my hospital, I have to make a case that, Betty Smith needs rituximab maintenance, and sometimes we have to and froing, often comes back, yep. And we've sort of said, well, okay, in my hospital we've said, okay, there are trials that give 500 milligrams, it's one vial every 6 months for 2 years, and they've accepted that. And that's kind of our standard ratio. It's not that it may not be the best one, but it's probably reasonable. Talking to people internationally, David Jane is an international vasculitis expert who most of us here know, and he says, yeah, that's a reasonable thing to do. So I think the answer is overlaid a little bit in maintenance in that there's a trade-off with whoever you're getting or however you're getting rituximab and who you're getting it from. So Chenau is entirely right about the fact there is no definitive protocol for maintenance. There are a number of interpretations of that. It might be, for instance, that quite a lot of protocols work. So there's been a couple of maintenance trials where they've used different protocols and they both seem to work. So yeah, that's kind of, I mean, it sounds negative, but it's actually not necessarily a negative thing. It might be there are a number of ways to get to where you want to get, which is to remain well and not have drug side effects and not be in hospital, not have rituximab infusions. So, you know, it is overlaid a bit by local practice, which is determined often at an individual hospital level. But yeah, to answer your question, Chenau's entirely right, because it's overlaid by local practice being determined by the fact that rituximab, we can't just write a script for rituximab and send it off. The best thing is, though, it looks like a number of different maintenance protocols work.
Is it always that patients are on prednisone for life, or prednisolone for life, and are there any long-term effects? The second one is only about a million. If prednisolone was attempted to be licensed today, there is no way it would make it past probably a phase 2 trial. So we don't know whether small amounts of prednisone long-term in GPA, so that used to be called Wegener's granulomatosis, is needed or not. So the Vasculitis Foundation in the US, through the Vasculitis Patient Powered Research Network, which we know a large number of Australians actually participate in. So I think Australians, our patients, actually have pretty high healthcare literacy and also have a high use of the internet. Not just for dodgy things, but actually for useful things. And we know that from the Vasculitis Foundation, the highest number of kids comes from Australia, which might reflect we don't tell our patients the right amount, but I suspect it also means that patients are more engaged in their healthcare, and those are the patients we like, people who are engaged. And so they do a study called the TAPIR study, T-A-P-I-R, like the little animal from South America with big nose. So they're looking at, and this is a real world study, so they're putting in patient data to say, are you on prednisolone or have you had it weaned? And then they're going to look at relapse rates. So there's a chance it doesn't find anything, but if you look at the literature over the last 10 years and look at going to meetings over the last 10 years, pretty much every year the kind of philosophy has changed. Well, I remember going every year, you shouldn't get people off prednisone, it's terrible. Next year, maybe we should. And then the next year was, you definitely should. We don't know the answer. Practically what happens is it becomes difficult when people have been on prednisone a long time to take them off. And then often the symptoms that you get from steroid withdrawal are very similar to perhaps a beginning relapse, and you don't know. And the last thing you want is someone to go back on 50 milligrams of prednisolone who really doesn't have a relapse of disease. So look, it's very difficult. And I don't think anyone would consider themselves a master of taking people off prednisolone. If you've got a rapid disease and you do really well, often we take you off now, especially with the short course of steroids that we're using now after the Pexivas trial, which you now mentioned, that we're using less steroid. We've got the opportunity to get people off that at 6 months. I think that means that less people will be left on steroids longer, but if people have had 10 relapses, the chance of getting off steroids, I'd say, is low. So, unfortunately, it's very disease-specific, and we don't know the right answer.
What about a low dosage, physiological dose of, say, 5 milligrams?
Yes, well, we don't know why in many diseases, so-called physiologic doses, somewhere between 4 and 7.5 milligrams of prednisolone, actually have a treatment effect. So in other diseases not related to this, like systemic lupus, a small dose of steroid you would think would do nothing until you take it away, and then you see some horrendous complications. Now we cannot, and no one can explain how you can go from 4 to 3 milligrams and have a severe reaction from disease. And there are a few diseases like that, where it makes no sense that people drop 1 milligram. If you look biochemically, it's hard to understand how that's doing anything. But a patient will relapse when you do that. The bad effects of 5 milligrams are essentially close to nil. At 7.5 milligrams, some people get bone loss and some people get skin changes. And then above 10 milligrams, your bets are off. So everyone will lose some bone. You lose most of your bone within the first 6 months, and more perhaps in the first 3 months of being on steroid. If you're on a stable dose of prednisone that's low, you generally don't lose more steroid, but don't lose much bone mass. But there are a whole host of other things that can happen to you. The length is dreadfully long. I would encourage you all to go to an excellent site which Catherine and I may have contributed towards, which is rheumatology.org.au. Under there, which is the Australian Rheumatology site, there's medication information. And if you look up corticosteroids, you can see the dreadful list, which many of you will be very familiar with. The next question...
So say one thing. So the only thing I would add to that is that even if you're on low-dose prednisolone, you have the opportunity to get screened for important complications. So, for example, yearly or 18-monthly bone density test, making sure your blood pressure is checked, controlled if necessary, checking on your blood sugars and those sorts of things, because they're really important things too. And so sometimes clinicians get a bit caught up in the condition itself, and everyone cheers when the condition's under control, but then we also have to check that the things that we're doing with and for you are not causing harm. And there are some of those things now that can be not only screened for, and the purpose of screening is not just to tell you the bad or good news, because if the news isn't great, there are now, there are gradually improving ways of treating these things. 30, 40 years ago, most blood pressure drugs made people feel terrible. I had to try, as a junior doctor, try and tell people, take this blood pressure drug, it'll probably make you feel, high chance of making you feel a bit awful for the rest of your life, but it'll help you in the end. As opposed to nowadays, when most blood pressures can be controlled with one or perhaps two drugs that generally don't have any side effects on an individual person that are meaningful. So, I think you have the chance also, if you are on prednisolone long term, to ensure that you're screened for blood pressure, glucose, bones, cholesterol, those sorts of things, all of which can be managed and risk resulting in those reduced, but only if you know that they're there. So, try and get screened yearly for them. Remind your doctor if necessary.
There are now many autoimmune cookbooks. Hopefully that's not booking your doctor available. Is there, although that can be understood sometimes. Is there any scientific basis to low inflammatory diets?
Yeah, I've got a little presentation, so I'll just race through that. Okay, everyone hear me all right? Okay. So anti-inflammatory diets, there's a cup of turmeric latte if you want. And just a disclaimer as well, as I said, I'm not a clinician or a doctor, so please see your health professional regarding any sort of diets. Okay, so I'm led to believe that Catherine knows quite a fair bit about this as well. So, all right, so just a quick, what is inflammation? So it's a response basically to repair damaged tissues or to eliminate toxins. And what's quite often released out of cells are what are called cytokines, which are chemicals, which go about increasing blood flow, blood dilation, and permeability and increased infiltration of white blood cells. So it can be friendly, but it can also be foe as well. In the case of, say, for example, type 2 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, and of course, rheumatosis, polyangiitis. Oops. Okay, gut health. Human intestine has approximately 1 by 10 to the 14 bacterial cells. That's 10 times the number of human cells. So you're overpopulated by bacterial cells. There's increasing evidence that the type, number and genetic diversity of gut flora are altered with age, obesity and also morbidity. So what? Gut bacteria have a symbiotic relationship with us, and they assist in promoting a healthy immune system. and protection against pathogenic bacteria. Since a change in Western diets in modern times, the microflora has altered substantially and has been shown to correlate with certain inflammatory diseases, for example, Clostridium and Yersinia species in Crohn's disease, Prevotalisate in rheumatoid arthritis, Helicobacter pylori in stomach ulcers and subsequent stomach cancers. I'm sure you've seen all these diets and cookbooks out there, autoimmune solution, anti-inflammatory diet cookbook. So which one? Well, there's actually a food pyramid that Dr. Wheels has put out, which looks very similar to a common food pyramid, but it's been replaced with anti-inflammatory food elements. So down the bottom we've got your core vegetables, fruits, and whole grains, cereals, up to red wine, which is I can't promote, obviously, but there's also chocolate right up the top as well, in moderation, of course. Do they work? Well, there's conflicting evidence in humans. There's been a reasonable number of studies done in rodents with, again, mixed results. The other issue is that the studies are often surveyed, so it's kind of almost anecdotal. Diets are often not isolated as well. So, for example, in one of the diets, people have ingested some fish, which has anti-inflammatory properties to it, but they also ingest other food elements, so it's complex. And studies that have been done have different methodologies as well. There was a study done surveying literature on potential anti-inflammatory elements, which was covering over 1,400 surveys. And what they found was they've got a list of all the... is there a pointer on this? Okay. Yeah. So you've got all your food items down the side here, and then you've got an overall value of your inflammatory score. More negative is the greater anti-inflammatory, more positive obviously the converse of that. Types of diets, we've got various diets out there, ketogenic diets, which are high in fat, very low carb diets, leads to metabolic acidosis. Examples are cheese, avocados, meat, poultry, eggs, coconut oil. It's not suitable for certain people, obviously, with the high fat, and there's limited evidence as to whether it works. Paleo diet, similar to the caveman style diet, lean meat, fish, eggs, vegetables, fruits, nuts. It's mainly cis mono or polyunsaturated fats, and again there's limited evidence as to whether it works. Mediterranean diets focuses on fish, vegetables and fruit, for example tomatoes, olive oil. There's more than limited evidence on effectiveness, particularly epidemiology studies. However, they're not longitudinal, so otherwise not over a long period of time. So the conclusion, gut microbiota is important in contributing to the healthy immune system. Modern Western diets have altered the gut flora, leading to increased inflammatory disease, which is well established. Re-altering the diet may recalibrate the healthy symbiotic gut flora. Food elements may reduce the inflammatory responses. And Mediterranean diet, there is some evidence of health benefits. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks, Mark. That's a good overview of the data. I think the good news about the anti-inflammatory diets that are out there is that they're well balanced. They focus on healthy foods, and we know those are most likely to be the anti-inflammatory ones. The Mediterranean diet is probably the best of them because it focuses on increasing fruit, vegetables, and olive oil, which is a monosaturated fat, which is more likely to be anti-inflammatory. What I would like him not to focus on is looking at that turmeric might be anti-inflammatory. No, food, nutrients are supposed to be in food. And so many studies have looked at just adding a certain vitamin or a certain extra something nutrient. They don't work. Our human body needs the best nutrients within food. So having a healthy diet is the best thing you can do for your body. And adding extra stuff that you buy is probably not going to help in most cases. I think it's worth having a think about what oils you might use in your home, and really substituting the oils that you use with olive oil or an olive oil-based spread is a really good idea, because we know that does drive you towards a more anti-inflammatory. What we don't know is whether eating an anti-inflammatory diet will help your vasculitis. We would love to know that, but we will need some longer studies and looking at people's diets in detail to do that. We're actually, I'm involved in an epidemiology study, which is of people, a group of 4,000 people who we've followed in the community for a number of years, and we're just about to look at their dietary inflammatory index, so we can see from all the food that they've eaten, what's their dietary inflammatory index from this, and then my plan is to have a look at whether their pain and inflammation improves over time if they stick to that sort of diet. It's not a randomised trial because we're letting people eat what they want, and people who eat healthy often do lots of other healthy things in their life as well. But I think it might give us some indication. So when I've got some results, I'll be giving it to Mark to put on the website.
One important thing to know is that expensive vegetables and expensive fruit aren't better than cheap vegetables and cheap fruit. What's important is the time it's taken. So if the apple has been in someone's fridge for 10 years, probably not quite as good as if you picked it off the tree yesterday. So it doesn't matter, and as you know, there's a lot of things about organic in Australia. There's no evidence that buying more expensive fruit and vegetables, and Australia has a high cost of fruit and vegetables, buying more expensive stuff is better for you. And you know, that might be important for some people. And some of those foods, and superfoods, there aren't any. And so, you know, one apple, and remember, an apple size is not the apple at Coles, which is that big. It's actually, if you ask a dietitian, an apple is the small ones that they sell children. That's a serving of fruit. And so people have this idea that they have to get tons and tons, but you don't. You just, a few pieces of broccoli and a potato, and you've got all you need, and it's not expensive. We might move on. Now, we've only got about 10 minutes left. We might combine some questions together. So I'll put questions 6, 10 and 9 together. And perhaps Chinau could lead off on that. So the questions combine why is rituximab only covered for induction or relapse but not maintenance? And then are there any statistics on remission and relapse for GPA and MPA? And how long may people stay in those conditions well off treatment? And particularly then, what are the side effects of rituximab? Chinau.
Okay, thanks. So this is a moving field. As I just said, rituximab is now available through PBS for those who need. That came about in 2016.
That's okay. I'm happy to repeat the gist of what I'm saying. Can you hear me now? Okay. So since 2016, we have rituximab available for induction if your doctor thinks that you need rituximab for induction. The next challenge is to go to government and apply for funding for government to allow or to give funding to give rituximab for those patients who need remission, to keep them well in remission. At the moment, we have to how do I put it? Unfortunately, at the moment, we stick by the rules. We cannot use rituximab through publicly funded schemes in remission rituximab for remission. We have to almost wait until the patient gets a major relapse, and then we apply for that. And all of us think that that's not good enough. We should not have to wait until the patient becomes unwell and then to save them again. We should try to keep them, prevent them from having a relapse. So I agree with you, that's the next challenge. The evidence of that is getting stronger, and in the next 6 to 12 months, I anticipate that there may be sufficiently strong evidence for us as a group, ANZVASC, and we'll need your patient representation to help us go, the government to go in that direction. So that's not too far around the corner. But I should qualify by saying that we probably should not, well, my view is that and that's my view, we probably should not be giving rituximab to every patient to keep them in remission, because there are potentially some side effects, so I'll address it in the next question. But some patients do need rituximab to keep them well. Okay, in terms of long-term side effects, we have been using rituximab for about 10 years, and more so our American colleagues and UK colleagues have done a lot more of that, used a lot more of that. There is no major side effect that I know of, except for lowering of immunoglobulin level. So immunoglobulins, you may have heard of hypogammaglobulinemia. Gamma globulins are the antibodies that we all have naturally to fight off infections. Because rituximab works on B cells, rituximab may reduce the level of antibodies. So some patients may develop hypo, that is low levels of immunoglobulins, and if they do so, they are potentially vulnerable to infections. But as we have heard in an earlier presentation, it is a little bit unpredictable at the moment who might get hypogamma or who might not. But this is something to watch out for in those who need to have rituximab several times. And that is why I said not all patients need rituximab, thankfully, but some patients do need rituximab regularly, and if that's the case, this is something to look out for. In terms of other, I often get asked, are there any other major side effects, like other cancers? Well, we have data up to 10 years now, and fortunately, nothing is showing, there's no other bad signal other than hypogamma. And for some of those patients who do develop hypogamma and get frequent infections, the treatment is to give you regular infusions of someone else's immunoglobulin, so what we call IVIG. So potentially that's one way to balance the problem. Anyone else?
This is nothing, I wouldn't all be worried about this, and I'm not personally worried about it as a physician prescribing it. Early on in the rituximab use, particularly in cancer and in a disease called lupus, there were several cases of a rare progressive brain inflammation that made a number of people very worried and concerned. That, what they call a signal, those cases really haven't cropped up in vasculitis at all. And it's been hard to definitively link them to rituximab in some people. So some of you may have read or heard about this, but the latest information about vasculitis, and I want to be updated further, is that this isn't a major concern or a significant concern, but it has been spoken about in the past.
It is called a concern. I have one patient with this problem called PML, progressive multifocal lupus encephalopathy, but that unfortunate patient had to have a lot more other treatments like steroids, cyclophosphamide, plasma exchange before he received rituximab. But fortunately, there are not many cases. I think there are only a handful that I'm aware of.
To answer the middle question, there was a question on the current stats on remission and relapse with GPA and MPA. The answer is how long is a piece of string? So that GPA by its nature is a relapsing disorder, and we say roughly 90% of people are relapsing, but I tell them that, and right after that I say, but that's giving you hope because really it's close to 100%. we probably just didn't follow you long enough. Whereas MPA disease, I don't know, I used to say 90%, but maybe 75%, depends which type of disease you have. So 75% being a monophasic illness, 25% means it can be relapsing. But every unit will have different statistics. And the length of time you remain in remission will depend on the nature of your disease and you. So we used to see, when we gave people a whole lot of oral cyclophosphamide, quite long remissions, 10 years, 5 to 10 years. But we also see a lot of horrendous complications for being on oral cyclophosphamide. Now we know that there is at least suggestive evidence that we use, let's say, less damaging treatment, but more tolerable, less side effect treatment, that relapse rates might have gone up. But that data is fluid, so every single study centre has different information. And so relapse rates really depend on the type of disease you have, maybe a little bit on your age, and certainly on the treatment you get and that you can tolerate. But it very much is individual. While we can tell you, oh look, if we had 100 people like you, 50 people like this, 20 people like this, and 30 people like this, we have no idea which one you are until it happens. So those kind of predictive information is not something we can readily tell you. We can say, oh, on average it's like this, but we don't know if you're going to be average when we see you. We know after the fact, which is not very helpful when you're the person faced with the disease up front. Yep, I was going to get. So the last question, just in a few minutes, Richard is second last question. Richard is an expert. Are there genetic basis for GPA, MPA, and other vasculitis?
So almost all autoimmune diseases have genetic susceptibilities followed by ill-defined infectious or environmental triggers. So in other words, that's the current thinking in autoimmune disease. In other words, there are very few rare autoimmune diseases, including 1 or 2 types of vasculitis, where you have a single deficiency. It's clearly genetic. You have a single deficiency of a gene, and then you get a problem. But most autoimmune diseases, there is susceptibility built in, and then things happen to a person that we don't understand very well. We know about a lot of what happens, but not so much how or why. So disease like type 1 diabetes has a moderately strong genetic component. If your brother has it, you've got a much higher chance of having it. Disease like lupus, a little weaker. Vasculitis certainly does have a genetic component, but it's really, in almost all cases, quite a weak genetic component. In other words, patients come to me, should I get my family tested? Will my children get this? And the answer is, the chances of you getting vasculitis was really pretty slim, but you were unlucky. The chances of them getting vasculitis may have gone up 1.5-fold, but their still chances is only about 2 in every 100,000. In other words, their excess chance of getting it is very low. Genetic tendencies tend to set the scene for what happens afterwards affecting you. And we're starting to know a lot about the genetics of vasculitis. There are now 4 or 5 big comprehensive genetic studies. Another one about to come out from a nice young woman who's worked in Cambridge and come back to Australia recently. And we know that from that, to follow on from the last question, that PR3 antibody disease is probably a different disease to MPO antibody disease. And it's probably a different disease again if anyone here has EGPA to EGPA type disease. So there are different genetic susceptibilities, but with rare exceptions, these are not the sole cause of disease. They kind of put a person in a position so that they might get disease if all these other things happen. I don't know if that's a very, whoever asked, I don't know if that's a very straightforward response to answer this. It's a simple answer to a complex question, but essentially, yes, there are genetic tendencies of vasculitis. It is not, by and large, genetically inherited, and generally speaking, you shouldn't be particularly worried, particularly if you have no family history of autoimmune diseases, of having a genetic cause that your brother or sister might get. Having said that, we're sort of using people with rare familial vasculitis as sort of a canary in a coal mine, looking at the genes that they've got different that might instruct us on some of the causes of vasculitis. So if there's anyone here who happens to have familial vasculitis or familial autoimmune disease, please feel free to contact me and we can think about it. But the bottom line is, yes, there is a genetic component, but for vasculitis, unlike some other autoimmune diseases, it's relatively low. Which begs the question of this, of course, is why then does it happen? And that's the 60,000 with inflation, $1 million question.
Do we have time for a comment?
I'd like to go back to the former question, which is the current statistics on remission. Can everyone hear me? I disagree with Damon respectively. I don't think it's as high as 90%. Depends is that there is a time factor. The longer you follow the patient, the higher is the cumulative chance of relapse. I'm a kidney specialist. The 5-year rate of relapse is about 50%. So that is to say 50% at 5 years do not relapse. About 50% at 5 years relapse. So it depends on how you look at it. The other thing is PR3 positive patients are more likely to relapse than MVO positive patients. So it's important that you find out your anchor status. You probably know already. But it is true, the longer one follows the patient, the more likely. Having said that, the therapeutic landscape is changing now. With rituximab, if in some patients, there are some patients who relapse frequently, and now we're almost to the point of giving those frequent relapses regular doses of rituximab, or perhaps when the anchor becomes high again. And so we may be able to slow down or reduce the number of relapses with this sort of new therapies like rituximab. So I think the prognosis for patients in 2019 is a lot better than the prognosis of patients 10 years ago, 20 years ago. And I've seen very convincing data to say that with each decade of treatment from the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years, if you happen to be a patient now compared to someone 30 years ago, your outlook is much better. So that's I would like to finish on that good note.
And then one final question, just we're at the time, from Hannah Raw. So Hannah asked a question. There is increasing evidence of benefits associated with cannabis and CBD oil. Can specialists legally prescribe these? CBD oil is not illegal, it's a supplement, and so it's not really where you can prescribe it, but you just get to pay more if you're a patient. CBD oil is not one thing. It's also got almost not a single randomised controlled trial behind it. So the problem with this is not the agents, and trust me, the vast majority of doctors couldn't give a rat's what you take if you get better. And that's real, we're not just saying that. If you tell me you drink dishwater and it cured your disease, and there was a study showing that, I'd tell you to drink dishwater. But there isn't. And there's as much good evidence behind marijuana and CBD oil. That's not to say that they might work in pain conditions. The evidence that they are anti-inflammatory is, let's say, flimsy. I don't care. If there was a fantastic study, awesome. But be aware that THC, that's the stuff that makes you high in marijuana, and occasionally it can be present in CBD oil, even though it says on the packet of your little supplements that it is not, because there are very poor regulations on manufacturing of CBD oil. So there already in New South Wales have been unfortunate cases of people taking CBD supplements that say does not contain THC, who have been stopped at roadside drug testing. So New South Wales do a lot of that. We don't do that in Queensland, but in New South Wales they do a lot. And people have gone and been fined and lost their licence. Because unbeknownst to them, these have been a couple of little old ladies, so they weren't, smoking bongs out the back. They had taken the supplement, and they then have got a criminal conviction against them through no fault of their own. And so this is being looked at. New South Wales government is very much aware that these products are unreliable. So that you might buy your packet of CBD, and CBD is not one thing. There are 20 different cannabinoids. And they all have different properties slightly, and some of them may well be therapeutic, but there is just not much evidence. And the large problem is the US legalised them before anyone did a study. So in the US they can't recruit people because everyone's already on them. So we don't know if they're good or not.
A couple of issues. I think that in some people, particularly the people you see on TV, which are, and I do use in paediatrics, they're not neurology, Poor children who have got intolerable seizures, when the potential benefit is really high and the risk relatively is really low, certainly there is anecdotal evidence that they may work, and similarly for chronic pain. I'm not a chronic pain specialist, and it's true that some people with vasculitis do have chronic pain, and I wouldn't probably want to prescribe cannabinoids for chronic pain. My understanding is you can, it's different in state by state, people can apply to prescribe medicinal cannabis. There was something interesting that came out recently in the academic literature about drug interactions, and so when I'm thinking about someone who takes a complementary medicine, I encourage them to tell me, I don't mind, I wouldn't go say I don't give a rat's, I don't mind, but I try and think of the known and possible benefits of that, and the known and possible risks, and the cost, and often I say to people, look, the only harm this might do is to your wallet. If you believe it's working, that's fine. But lastly, there's the interactions with the current medications that you're on. And I think it's important to know that when they did a search for the known inducers of liver enzymes, for example, and what the cannabinoids do to liver enzymes, and the drugs that metabolize with these same enzymes, they found, for example, that these drugs are highly likely to inhibit the metabolism of corticosteroids. So I encourage you, if you're on complementary alternative stuff, as long as you can trust your doctor not to be dismissive and horrible to you, and I think that's really important that doctors aren't like that I try and encourage, try not to sound dismissive and horrible, but also encourage them to let me know, because my drug information service can often tell me whether it's like to interact with things that you might be already on, because that can be important as well.
The biggest interaction probably is with quite a few antidepressants.
Yeah.
There are a large group called SSRIs where the majority have potential interactions. Obviously, when something's a supplement, then we don't have a lot of biochemistry that drug companies have done to say whether it's safe or not. So often they're just possible. And there's one drug used in rheumatoid arthritis called tofacitinib, which has almost definite interactions with some CBD oils. We don't use that in vasculitis, but those drugs called JAK inhibitors, given they work in pretty much every inflammatory disease that we've tried in so far, may well come to vasculitis at some point. But the potential is there because we don't know what's in these things. They haven't been studied by the drug company that's marketed a drug. We're left telling you, well look, it might interact. And interactions can be really bad. This is not just make you feel a bit unwell, they can kill you. And so that sounds a bit alarming. It's not that doctors are just trying to frighten you. We're just saying we're frightened too. We want you to keep living. And when we don't know, well, we have a fear as well.
Yeah, I think it's incumbent on us not to sound dismissive and unsympathetic to what are real, genuine symptoms, real concerns, and a real desire in this somewhat uncontrolled, difficult to control disease to exert, understandably, some control over your life and your condition. But within that framework, I would rather personally hear that someone says, I'm taking this, I'm taking that, and then we can go through whether it's an issue or not. And as I said, often the case is, well, as I said, I sort of throw away comment, the only harm it might do is to your wallet. It might do you good, it shouldn't do you any harm. In that situation, I certainly feel reassured anyway. We know that I don't know about vasculitis, we know that many, studies overseas have shown that many vasculitis patients don't tell their doctors that they're taking alternative or complementary medicines, either because they don't want to or they feel scared to or whatever. But it's something that's probably worth knowing about, and I hope we can treat people who tell us that with the respect they deserve.
On that note, I'm just going to wrap the session up. But finally, I'd like, if you have any other questions, that'd be great.
In the preamble, I was given to understand.
That the society is trying to establish a communication between clinicians and patients, and that Mark is taking some responsibility for this. My question is, have the clinicians been surveyed about what kind of information they would like from the patients? And is the society trying to find out what kind of information and what kind of questions or what format or means of communication that they would like this should provide. And Mark, if I can may add to that question, we were invited, I think, to put questions through you. Would you mind passing on an address that we could do this?
Yes, so we don't mean this to be a fixed dialogue, just in this case, we mean it to be ongoing. And I would think, sort of speaking for the board, that if Mark got like 10 questions and they're all the same, then he would forward to that, and we might put an answer up that we can all bounce around by email and back. Two, our biggest question is, because we've never really asked a patient group before, what do you want? How do you want it? And how do you want to receive it? Most doctors know what they want, but they don't necessarily know what their patients want or what their unmet needs are, because you've got 15 minutes at your doctor's, and we know that people forget the questions they were going to ask, and they forget the question they always wanted to ask. One, they might feel foolish. Two, there are no stupid questions. And often asking it in a non-threatening manner by email is much easier, especially if it actually turns out that 4,000 other people actually have the same question they've never asked either, and that's generally quite common. So we'd really like patients to suggest, and Mark's already agreed to do this, to come up with ways how you want interaction with us. Person-to-person interaction is always fantastic. Humans are designed to talk to other humans, but there is some interaction where people find actually electronic reports are much easier, and often those are associated with mental health. There's some good evidence that anxiety is better managed, not for everyone, but on average, by a robot. Because you can tell them anything, because they're a robot. You're not going to judge you. And so there's lots of different ways feedback can occur, but we'd like to know through Mark what interaction you want, how often, what's too much, what's too little, what style, and what you want to hear about. We don't know yet what we want to know. That's why we're starting it. So,
do you have a response? Did that answer your question?
Yes and no. The question still remains, how do we contact you, Mark?
Oh, yes. So it'll be through our website, which is ANZVASC.org. You can send emails to us. So we'd really love some feedback about today. That would be fantastic. And I guess from time to time, particularly if we want to do some advocacy around maybe Chanel and Richard wanting to go to something like the PBAC, that we would want some patients to come with us or to give us some written feedback about what you want, and we could somehow send that out and ask patients for that. So that's the sort of thing. Also from time to time we'll be wanting to do some research, and we might be asking you to get involved. I'm personally really interested in patient-reported outcomes and also in patients' experience of their illness. That's the sort of research that I do, as well as some epidemiology. So those are the sort of things that are really great to have patients' input on. And the other thing is there's been a lot of change in the way we apply for research funding. And in the past it was researchers just deciding what we thought was best for you, and then we went ahead and would get write a research grant and get that money. But now we want to, I guess that we've changed, and we want to do research with patients, not on patients. And so the way we are writing research grants now means that we need to have patient input before we start the research study, when we're writing the application, and that means we're going to need some of you lovely people to help us with that, and we'll be asking that from time to time.
Thank you. Structurally, I'd encourage people who want to take part to apply to become associate members of ANZVASC. So there's an associate member category, which is for people clinicians overseas, but also for patients and consumers. It's relatively straightforward. Our constitution says that you have to be sponsored by somebody, but initially, of course, it's really there as a device in case, so the board has technically the chance to say no. So I think that's on the website, and associate members have a voice. They have the capacity to speak at meetings. They don't have a voting capacity. We are setting up a series, and we're starting probably with 2 or 3 rather than 10, of working parties in different aspects of vasculitis. And although we still have to finalise in terms of reference for those committees, in terms of how they're going to work, it is highly likely that we'll be asking for consumer representation and input into those working parties. For instance, one might be on clinical trials. Another one might be on education, for example. Education is sort of a broad topic as a sort of working title. So we have every intention of having consumer representation at all level, including but not limited to being associate members, and also having significant input into the working parties that we end up establishing. We are new, we've only just started, we're unfortunately time poor and we're resources poor, but we think this is a great idea and we think we can make a difference over time, and we'll do our best to do that.
So yes, that was true. I did look on your site to become an associate member, and it did just say a sponsor. So can that just be your doctor that signs off on it?
Look, no, I think really, does it say CB or anything? I can't remember.
It does say for associate.
Okay, so I think we do have a privacy policy which is on the website, and so I think we might not have thought this through entirely appropriately, but effectively we want to know that someone is wanting to join for genuine reasons. And I think saying, for example, you know, my name is so-and-so, here's my date of birth and address, and I want him date of birth. But you know, and I'm a patient with granulomatous polyangiitis. Yeah, it needs to be pretty straight. It's pretty simple. Well, yes, it does, because we have.
That's okay. So my doctor's fine.
Or it's actually by a member. So at the moment, as we grow, I would, for instance, put down me, if you know me, or Mark. We've got membership forms at the back.
Membership forms here now, so if you wanted to join up
Just
today,
get your
we can sign it, and I can.
Especially in the initial setup phase for people who are willing to join, we're not trying to make a barrier, but the Constitution, we had to have something there in case we want to decline someone's application for membership for whatever reason.
The question was, one question is whether her doctor can sign.
Yeah.
No, it's meant to be a member.
One of you guys.
One of us, like Mark or me. You know, look, we're okay with this at this stage. We need to just build things up.
So you can do it now.
Yeah.
I think it's meant to be a member, that's all. You just have one last question. Oh yes, of course.
If your doctor's a member, that's easy.
Yeah. Not yet. He's not, but I can make it.
Not yet.
There's a question.
I guess on average, I understand that GPA affects people between 40 and 60 on average. Are you finding that it's affecting the younger generation nowadays? Has that age bracket changed or shifted, or is it still much the same?
Given there's only one person who sees children here, and that's me sometimes, I'm willing to take anyone else's comments. I think it's very difficult to know whether it's changed because what we call case ascertainment. So effectively, we discovered ANCAs back in 1980 something, and so as testing becomes more widespread, conditions that look strange, and unknown are going to be diagnosed because we have great capacity to diagnose it. In addition, in children, I'm now going to comment further. There's probably more likely to be a significant genetic influence because really young children are getting it. It's hard to know whether it's changing, and we had a discussion a bit about this earlier, but certainly it's not unknown for young people to get this condition. Though I guess as physicians, we tend to sort of default to contrasting, and we say, oh well, unlike lupus, which is a disease of young women, this is a disease of older people. And that's sort of a bit oversimplistic for what the reality is. So yes, young people do get it. Yes, children even do get it. The mean age of onset is when you're older compared to some other autoimmune diseases like type 1 diabetes. And I don't know if there's any data, and it will be really hard to work out whether the more and more young people are getting it or not, to be honest, with any accuracy.
Okay.
I've not heard of strong data to suggest that it has changed in its age bracket.
But I think there's some questions that are answerable, and some that are very difficult to answer. And I reckon this is a very difficult question to answer.
Thank you.
We might just call it to a close there. But if you have questions, or if you have friends who have the disease, or know other people who have disease who also have questions, get them to put them together. Even get together and think about questions you would all like answered. Especially if it's something, oh yeah, I don't know that either, no one knows it. Those are the things we want to answer. And send them to Mark through the website, and then we'll answer them by just sort of sending them around, and we might put some of those answers up anonymously on the website. Because those are the things we'd like you to have.
It might be useful to have FAQs, frequently asked questions, which cover
maybe 60-70% of patients, but not all.
Yes.
Right, thank you very much. Hopefully you've found it instructive, and thanks for attending.